Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Team Tuesday this week with Juan Rodriguez. Hey, Juan, welcome back.
And thank you, Vasco. It's a wonderful Tuesday.
Indeed. And we're going to make it even more wonderful by sharing some great tips. And before we go into the tips, the book that most influenced you in your career as a Scrum Master, what was that one?
Okay, I actually have two for you. And the first book addresses mindset and how you interact with people. And it is called Fish. And basically what it does is it uses Pike Place Fish Market in Seattle as its setting and how they became a productive, happy team. And it uses an example of another company that is struggling to make their teams interactive, have fun, enjoy work. So I like that book because it helps you get out of the mindset of we're just going to work to be doing stuff so that way we can make a living, instead of saying, this is a big part of our life. How do we make it enjoyable? That's why I like that book.
That's a great reference. By the way, who was the author so that we can put the link for people to find it easily?
The authors are Stephen C. Lundin, Harry Paul, and John Christensen.
All right. We'll put the link on the show notes so that people can easily find it. And what was the second book, Juan?
Okay, so the second book is actually how I use to explain what I do as a Scrum Master to people that aren't technical. And it is called the Total Money Makeover. It talks about money, so people understand money. And the reason I like this book is because it talks about the iterative process, stakeholders, people that things you have to do in order to make your budget and how you go through that, and people can relate to that. So that's why I like this book.
So how did you use it to introduce a Scrum Master role, though?
Okay, so they ask how you do a Scrum Master role, and I'll go, okay, everybody has a budget or some way of managing their money, which means you have stakeholders, you have someone that is responsible for ordering how you're going to pay that, which would be your PO, and then you have someone that's going through and making sure everything gets done, and that would probably be like your Scrum Master. And then since this book talks about the iterative process of getting out of debt, it actually has 7 steps. You're working in sprints, and that's how I tie it in. And my in-laws and my mom and dad, they seem to get it then.
Absolutely. That might be an interesting thing to write a blog post about if you ever come to that. But I do agree with you that we need, as Scrum Masters, simple yet very concrete ways to introduce the Scrum Master role to people who are not technical, and sometimes also to people who are technical, because a lot of, many interviews we have here on the podcast, we end up talking about the mismatch between expectation of the Scrum Master role between the team and the stakeholders, or between the Scrum Master and the stakeholders or the team as well. So it's important for us to have that way to communicate. So thank you for sharing that, Juan.
Oh, yes.
So now we turn our attention to teams and how sometimes they become their own worst enemies. And of course, we want to hear the story of a team that you work with. Tell us a little bit about the project so that we understand the context, and then describe for us how those small behaviors or patterns started to develop over time that ultimately led to problems.
Okay. So the team that I'm going to talk about was actually a marketing team. And they worked on a sales tool for selling chillers, which are large air conditioning units for big buildings. And this team was a mixture of onshore and offshore team members. And the thing that was really hard with this team was that they had no overlap. So one part, the
no
offshore
time overlap, I guess you mean.
Yeah, no time overlap, exactly. The offshore team was in China. The onshore team was all the way from Texas to Pennsylvania. So we had multiple time zones to cover. So it was very hard to have that day-to-day communication. In addition, you had language barriers. So the manager of that team happened to speak Chinese and English, so she was pretty much the intermediary for both teams. So what was self-destructing about that team is everything started flowing through the hiring manager, who coincidentally happened to be one of the developers on that team.
Wow, that's quite a mixture.
Yes, it's for me that's a good recipe for not having a successful team.
And tell me a little bit more about what kind of patterns you observed. So obviously the main pattern is that all the communication had to flow through that manager. That's the thing you already described. But what started to emerge from that? Like what were the other things you were observing in the team?
So what happened there is that they tried to do a daily stand-up, and they tried doing that by a survey, and that didn't go very well because it became more of a status report rather than an interaction of, hey, here's what we're planning on doing today. Here's the problems I'm having. Can you help me? I got stuck here. Here's where my code is. Can you pick it up and go? It became more of, I did this today. I plan on doing this, and everything's okay here on our side.
The problem is always somebody else's side, right?
Yeah. So then they switched the daily stand-up to, okay, we're going to meet once a week, and we're going to offset it. So one morning in the US, China would meet, which would be their evening. And then the next week, it would be flipped around, where the US would come in the evening and China's morning. And we would have a phone call for about an hour and a half to sync up for the week. And we would ask questions of the team, and both teams would be completely dead silent.
Wow. What was the reason why they were silent?
Part of it was they didn't really know how to answer the questions, or didn't understand it. So the manager would then translate it, and then they would try to answer in English, and that didn't go so well. So they would speak in Chinese, and the manager would translate it to English, and that just made the meeting go on and on. In the end, what happened is we did a TRITS as a retrospective as to how to make the most worst meeting you possibly can, and then took action items away from that to address it. And one of the things that we found is that if they typed in the question or the answer, it made it much easier to communicate back and forth. So that's how we got that meeting to be more productive, and we shortened the time by about a half hour because of that. So
yeah, that's a great tip, by the way, right? Like if you have not only time problems, so somebody's in their beginning of the day, so they're fresh and ready to work, and while the others are at the end of the day probably tired and sometimes even frustrated or angry at that time, communication isn't necessarily easy. But if you try to put the communication in writing, first it eases up the problem of speaking, right? Because it will be easier to write than to speak for many people, especially in a different language. You could use translators, dictionaries, whatever. And also, it gives time for people to consider what they read, right? Like, I don't know if that's what happened to that team, but at least as far as I have experienced that using, for example, written down stand-ups, like using Slack or whatever, it gives people the time they need in order to reflect on what they read and then type something up if they have questions or whatever that might be. Was that something you observed in that written version of the meeting?
Absolutely. What was happening is the people in China, they would take the stuff that was written and throw it into a translator, and it would come back with a translation that was close enough that they understood what was going on. And then they would reply back, and they typically reply back in English, once in a while in Chinese, and we would have to do the same thing. But it was, once you got it written, they were able to look at it and say, oh, I understand what they're saying.
Also, because when we write, we are more precise with the language, because you can't just use words like thing or that thing, right? You have to express more clearly, perhaps more specifically, what is the topic or the object of the discussion.
Correct. And you catch yourself using slang as well. So you remove the slang out, and it becomes a concrete word that's more universal to be understood.
Yeah, as you said, it helps us be much more aware of how we communicate.
And The second thing that happened with that team is the manager was doing a lot of the work. So I had a conversation with the manager and I said, this is really a team responsibility. So why don't we push the focus from everything coming to you to the team coming up with the solution on how to work with each other.
And because you had the meeting, then you could do that, right? Because otherwise, if it was spoken communication, you would still need the manager to be in between.
Correct. And she still stayed in between a little bit, but for the most part, she stepped back and said, you guys need to work this out. I'll be in the meeting if there's something that's really hard that you guys can't communicate to each other. And in the end, they ended up start working with each other and get the things that they needed to get done in that meeting and then be more productive for the rest of the week.
Absolutely. A great example of tackling a very difficult language and time zone barrier. Thank you for sharing that, Juan.
Oh, absolutely.
Tuesday is Team Day here on the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast. But tomorrow we talk about something that goes beyond the work we do with the teams. We will talk about how to lead change and what our guests have learned from leading and participating in change programs during their career. See you tomorrow. We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.